purchased carbon offsets voluntarily, would you donate to support climate change projects if tax receipts were available? And half the people answered yes. So I see that there's an opportunity for us to have green, pay for green in the city. And there's, the exciting thing about this is where raising taxes might be challenging to pay for the initiatives we want. There's many people that are excited to do something, would feel great about contributing, and we can set something up similar to things that are already in place, but market that for our city. And the best place for these kind of donations to go would be a reserve fund, and then from there, they could go out to various projects. So for that reason, I'll be supporting this and also the main motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Helmer.
So I don't think during the budget deliberations is the right time to be creating reserve funds. This is not something that has any kind of parameters around it. Usually when we create a reserve fund, we would direct staff to come back with a report, say, hey, here's the parameters for the reserve fund. Then we would figure out some appropriate level of financing for it and what we would expect to draw from it. And then we would start drawing from it. That's the process we follow for most reserve funds. And I think we should be very cautious about creating something sort of on the fly and redirecting the funds here from this business case into some future to be determined reserve fund. I just want to comment on some of the challenges. I was listening very carefully to what Mr. Stanford was saying, because Councillor Turner was asking, do you see any issues here? The answer seemed to be no, but I'm not so sure about that. In the operating part of the business case we're looking at, that's split between a couple of different sources of financing. Some of it is user fees, some of it is the EEE, and some of it is tax levy on an ongoing basis to support employees. Right? So it's not capital for capital projects, it's money to support employees, right? There's an FTE impact there and you can see it in the business case. I don't like the idea of paying money in from the levy to a reserve fund and then drawing on the reserve fund to pay for operating personnel. Like I could see some problems with that. If this is a temporary thing where the staff are only gonna be around for a while, sure. But I don't know that that's a great connection to be making in terms of how we're actually financing these things going forward. In the capital part of the budget, there's the capital levy component, which I think that's very easy. You're just sort of putting a capital levy in, you're contributing it to the reserve fund, no big problem. And then there's a bunch of reserve funds that we're being drawn on already to pay for these things. And essentially what we were doing is just transferring money from one reserve fund into another reserve fund. So those are my initial comments. I want to say, I don't think the general idea of creating a climate change reserve fund is actually a good idea. I see all of the reserve funds of the city almost as potential sources of financing to pay for climate change adaptation and to deal with many of the problems that we're facing. If we think that we're going to be financing them all out of this one reserve fund, I don't think that's going to go very far. The major roads projects that we have to do, the sewer projects, infrastructure, stormwater improvements, all those things, those are the things that really make a big impact on dealing with, especially on the mitigation side and adaptation side. They're gonna make a big difference. So I'm very wary of creating essentially a small reserve fund and then expecting that to be the primary source of financing for climate change action. I'd rather draw on the existing reserve funds as appropriate to pay for the different things that need to be paid for. So, you know, I think this is a kind of a middle ground. It's kind of an odd business case because it's sort of half decided and half pending. I can see that there's some ambiguity there and people are uncomfortable with it. They want to just put it in a reserve fund. I see that as being more ambiguous rather than more specific. I'm comfortable with these 5 ideas that are in front of us. I think these are reasonable ideas. We've talked about them before. You know, it's the bike share, reducing corporate energy usage, you know, doing some projects in the community to help people reduce their energy usage. I think these are good ideas that can be financed this way right now. And if we were to put them in a reserve fund, I think it would just be more time before we actually started taking action. And I don't think that's the right right approach. At the very least, we'd have to get reports back about what is this reserve fund and set it up and then start drawing on it. And even that kind of delay, I think, is not necessary. So, I mean, I'm open to a discussion about the climate change reserve fund at a committee meeting, not a budget meeting. And I think in terms of the budget, I support this kind of allocation for these kind of projects, which is what's in front of us in the business case. And I think if people want to see those things happen, vote for the business case that's in front of us, and let's not change it into something else.
Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you very much. And so I'm in a bit of a dilemma here as well, because I support the original motion. And I appreciate what Councillor Turner is trying to do here, but I have a few concerns that we may be backing ourselves in a little bit of a box here with the reserve fund. And I'm not, I heard loud and clear from staff that continuing to do more is what's needed. We had a public participation meeting a few weeks ago. Two things came out of that public participation meeting: affordable housing and climate change. We know 80% of the public thinks climate change is a concern and looks to governments to do something about it. So I'm willing to hear how this conversation is going to go forward. I may reserve some of my comments to the end with what I've got to say, but I'm looking to my colleagues here to see where this goes.
Councillor Squire.
I agree with Deputy Mayor, Helmer entirely on the issue of the reserve fund, to create a reserve fund as we're sitting here. And my problem was with, should we spend money before we've completed a plan? I'm worried about setting up a reserve fund. We don't know what's the balance we're going to maintain in that reserve fund. What are going to be the limitations on it? It's just something I don't believe we should do in this particular way. On the actual funding of the projects, I'm still thinking about that. I tend to agree with the Deputy Mayor that these are fairly obvious steps that we should be taking in any event. But I think it's really important to remind people that already in the budget process, we've done green bins. We've made huge new investments in transportation. And I think there's been a lot of focus on anything that's going to help with the climate change problem is included in something that says climate change file. And I don't think that's right at all. And I was very purposeful in making sure we made investments in things that I thought were significant. Green bins, certainly transit, fully investing in all of the transit improvements that will hopefully increase ridership. So I really want to remind people that climate change, and I think the Deputy Mayor touched on this, climate change action is everywhere. It's not just in one little amount of money or one little file. It's across this entire organization. And I think Council generally has supported climate change initiatives in other areas. I just think it's important to have your plan before you spend money. And that's the challenge I have. So I've still got to resolve that one. But the reserve fund, that worries me, that we would go ahead and create a new reserve fund just now.
Okay, that's the Councillor Van Meerbergen.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to pick up where Councillor Squire was going. I was giving that the same thought myself. And that is, for years, we as a city and on behalf of our taxpayers have been investing in transit, encouraging people to get on buses, investing in bike lanes. We've been doing that for years. This has been going on. Biogas, methane flare at the W12A. That we've invested mightily in that over years. We've built channels in the W12A to get the gas to the flare. So we've invested in planting trees, lots of trees. We've spent a lot of money on trees. So these things are all part of the climate change fight, if you want to call it that. But the problem is that I'm seeing is now we have kind of like two categories. We've got just kind of like the regular budget, and that's not really climate change fighting. But then now we got this other one called climate change fighting, or climate change, whatever it is. So it's number one, confusing. Number two, Why aren't we giving credit where credit is due in terms of what we've already spent from the budget, which is millions?
I have no other speakers, but I have Councillor Turner who wants to wrap up. So, Councillor Van Holst,
Yes, sorry, I'm,
on the amendment again?
yes, so
Okay.
I think I've,
Like, you've already spoken
convinced.
on the amendment, and we're about to vote on it. Do you need to speak again to this?
okay, well, if you like, I'll speak to the main motion. but,
Perfect.
thanks.
Councillor Turner, you want to wrap up the amendment? I just want to get things moving. We'll know what the main motion looks like, and then we can continue to talk about the issue, because when the amendment, there's people want to still speak on the main motion, that's perfectly fine. Councillor Turner, to wrap up.
Thanks, I appreciate the debate. I think it's an appropriate debate. I think it's one we need to have. There was some apprehensions about how the money was spent or whether the allocations were appropriate in here. This was a way of addressing that. As to a reserve fund, yeah, and everybody talking about how we invest in a whole bunch of things that are environmentally focused. We're going to do that. We're going to do that as a city. But I would say, draw a parallel to, say, an economic development reserve fund. A lot of the stuff we do in the city is economic development, but it doesn't draw from a reserve fund. And every once in a while we do. The ability to have a reserve fund is to provide some incremental funding or supplemental funding to top up some initiative. It also identifies that the question of environment is enough of a priority to us, that we are going to set aside funds specifically for that action. We should be doing it through everything we do, and I think we will. And a lot of great examples of what we have done through this budget were raised. Transit, green bins, these are good things. But going forward, we need to be able to make sure that there's a difference between business as usual and business after a declaration such as we made, and that we are prepared to invest and stand behind that. Should the amendment fall, I'm cool with that. I really hope that at least the business case moves forward. But I think we need to be darn sure that we've identified that we're not just doing business as usual going forward, that we've actually identified how we're going to fund a lot of the initiatives that we're going to have to do if we're going to be serious about this declaration.
Okay, I'm going to open the amendment for voting. This is the amendment to dedicate the amounts to a climate change reserve fund with the parameters set out in the wording of the motion. I'll open that for voting.
Closing the vote, the motion's lost, 4-11.
Okay, back to the main motion without any amendments. I'll look for speakers there. Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate where Councillor Turner was going with that last motion. I'm hopeful that council will support this business case on its own without a reserve fund. Deputy Mayor Helmer made a number of really good points. There is, I think with the reserve fund, there was a worry for me in my mind anyway of continuing with these silos, and we have seen a holistic approach to the climate change action, which is good. We have some of the investments we have made in other things have benefited and paid tribute to the climate emergency declaration. However, this is a plan that is focused on that. Another point, just as an aside that I could make as part of the budget and the business cases, is I think there are a lot of interrelations of things, intersections going on throughout the budget, and it's not always recognized in the budget. I do acknowledge that. One thing for me that has stood out is making London a safe place for women and girls. We have received some comments from the community where we don't seem to have dedicated resources to that. But I think there are a number, just like with climate emergency, there are a number of things that we have done in the budget that do benefit that pillar. And so I don't want to take away from that. I don't want to say that we're not already doing things, but I think with this plan, this business case, it is a direct action towards the plan. And as Councillor Hopkins said, the gallery was full on our last public participation meeting, and overwhelmingly the public showed up to ask us to support not just the creation of the Climate Emergency Action Plan, but actually funding the plan, and that's what I see as Part B. It's one thing to have a plan, you have to fund the plan. And the five parts of the business case that are in here are essential, and we need to have the funding in place for those five actions. I see this as sort of like a reserve fund ipso facto to fund this particular, sorry. To fund this particular business case. We're earmarking these funds so that staff can continue. And Mr. Stanford has, you know, as has been discussed, has been doing a lot of great things, leading us to this point where we are today. So it's not like we have to start absolutely from scratch, like a lot of communities probably do, are playing catch up with climate emergency. We have a good base that's in place, and I thank the staff through you, Mr. Chair, for that. But we absolutely must fund this business case, and I will be supporting that.
Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you. And again, I hope my colleagues here will support this. It's really the five business cases starting. We've got to start somewhere. The amount of money, it really is just a placeholder. Who knows what it's going to look like when it comes back. I do want to ask two questions through you, Mr. Chair, to staff. The community engagement part, if this is supported, how will that roll out, given the interest in the community as to what we are going to be doing as a city, and how that will look like, because there's a lot of interest in the community. And the second question is, climate inaction, do we have any idea how much it will cost us as a municipality? Or generally speaking, I know I don't want to put you on the spot for numbers, but I have a concern about inaction and the cost to the municipality.
Through the chair, the first one is much easier to tackle. We've already launched the engagement process. Our website is up and running. We have our first feedback opportunity that has been out there now for a couple of weeks, and people are hearing about it, they're responding. We're now developing our final process for how we're going to be out there in the community and what type of opportunities there will be for direct engagement. So that information will be available over the next couple weeks, basically, where it'll be much clearer on how we're going to be involved in the community. We've got a number of great models to follow, everything from the London plan, including how we did our last community energy action plan. So we're very comfortable in the direction that we're heading. And then we also want to leave a portion of the engagement open to see how people wish to be engaged. We think that's very important as well, especially the business community. The second comment, or the second question about inaction, I don't want to guess, because I know the number would be wrong. What I would like to comment on, though, is that we spend money right now on energy, and the energy creates greenhouse gas. There is a business case for climate change, and the business case is one of where there is a level of investment where there is a huge return on investment. And just by way of an example, we spend about $1.6 billion a year on energy across the entire city. A 1% reduction is $12, $13, $14 million in savings. You quickly add up that when you do reduce, there is money that is returned. The question is, where does that get returned? Well, it gets returned into people's pockets, into businesses' pockets. That is really important, and that's all part of that. And that will be part of our upcoming work and presented back to you on the business case for environmental action with respect to climate change.
I have Deputy Mayor Helmer, Councillor Van Holst, Councillor Lewis, and Mayor Holder.
I just wanted to emphasize one of the specific actions in the business case, which is around the transportation demand management, or a transportation management association. I think this is a very good idea that we could really benefit from in London. And I think there's potentially lots of potential ideas that could come out about getting employees to work in a more affordable way. And I think we got to look at it not just in the downtown, but in the whole primary transit area, where we have a lot of really big employers. And then also in the industrial areas where there's particular challenges in terms of people getting to work and to jobs in an affordable way. I think this one has a lot of potential. So if we fund it and we get businesses interested in lowering the costs of people coming to work, working together in ways, for example, if businesses all of a sudden started providing their employees with transit passes instead of parking, and they find that that's a lot cheaper for them, and all of a sudden people can get to work in a much more affordable way, you know, that's going to be a really big improvement in the City of London. And I could imagine there's a lot of downtown workers, for example, the cost of parking is just going up and up. And I think employers are looking for ways to contain costs and lower the costs for their employees. We've been making significant investments in transit. The service is much better. People can get to work more easily, and they can save money for the business that they're working for. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there, but the funding of convening people is what is involved in this business case. Get them together, figure out what's going to work, what kind of improvements could be made, how they can sort of solve the common problems that they've got by working together. You know, I say in the primary transit area because Councillor Squire will know this very well. You know, the hospital is looking at adding parking. And they're a major employer. Lots of people go in there. And if they have options that don't involve building more parking, because parking is very expensive, they're going to want to pursue those, right? And I think it applies all the way along the corridors, the whole primary transit area. So I think that project in particular is quite good. I will say for Mr. Stanford's benefit, I'm glad to see the property assessed clean energy making its return in this business case. Perhaps we'll eventually do it.
Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you. Councillor Turner was talking about an amount that we might allocate for assessment growth in terms of what Canadians use for carbon. So that's 22 tons of carbon a year. And the amount for offsets is typically $20. So $440 is what it would take for someone to become net zero. And what I'm really excited about is that although we can't charge people this amount using the regressive tax structure that we've got, we can ask those who are interested in helping out to donate. And if 10% of Londoners decided, hey, I'm gonna donate to be net zero, that would be $17 million added to our budget. That would do a lot. And you know, if we didn't get 10%, you'd ask, well, just how committed are we? But the other thing is, even people that are limited in their funds, and I was had a meeting with a seniors group, still many of those people interested in donating some. So I think we're in a position where we can easily have the green pay for green, if you will. And I think it will work out really well. And so I'm very confident that we'll be able to cover the costs of these programs if we move on those directions, and even more. And so happy to support these because some of them are very good ideas on their own right.
Councillor Lewis.
Hopefully this is quick, Mr. Chair, because I'm generally supportive of all of these. I just through you have a quick question to our staff. We dealt with the bike share pilot project earlier, well, late last year, I guess now. It came through Civic Works and then Council, and that was approved. So seeing the bike share in here, can you just very, very quickly tell me why this is in here as opposed to the base budget of the Transportation Department?
Through the chair, we went to Civic Works in January of this year and actually brought to their attention and council's attention the e-scooter program. We've been directed to add that into our request for proposals. So that particular project is just about out the door. What that has actually done, it's going to actually delay us completing the business case and the business plan to come back to committee and council. So the earliest we predict right now that there would be any action taken in London, if council desired to, would be late this year with respect to either a bike share or e-scooter program. So the reason this is here is that depending on the outcome of that RFP, there are a couple areas where we do believe funding will be required if council wishes to move forward on that. One of the areas, of course, is that initially we're going out with a certain size project. What has been viewed in other communities or occurred in other communities is that once it is proven successful, you need money to expand. And once things begin to expand into some other areas, they sometimes become less feasible, or there's a desire where there's reason to actually contribute money to make it more feasible. Those types of things will be explored. So we've actually set aside some dollars here to be able to accommodate how we actually not only market the program, but move into other areas of the city should we decide to pursue this particular area. So this item right here is a classic example of it. It is clearly a placeholder subject to council deciding if they wish to move in this particular space, but it is a space of the transportation sector, which we know very well is a very important space that we have to tackle.
Great, that answers that question. And when the original bike share proposal came forward, I had some concerns about the lack of hubs in the north, east, south, and west. So hearing that this opens the door to a possible expansion, perhaps a little sooner in the calendar, is satisfactory to me. Thank you.
I have Councillor Squire left.
I actually think, you know, I think you could have done better if you had not done this, and I think you would have gotten a lot more money through other meetings, other things. You would have got a lot of money for projects that were both friendly to the environment and climate change, but also infrastructure related. And I think, so that's the one thing. I'm starting to understand and appreciate that all the money we spend on infrastructure that helps climate change is important. And I would have liked to continue on that route, but this isn't where we are right here. Earlier this morning, Councillor Van Holst used the words philosophical hardliner. And, you know, those are really good words. I like them. And if I had feelings, they might have been hurt. So, so I mean, I think this is one where, here's what I'm going to say. I represent Western. And the students at Western think this is really important. And they think this is something that they want to see. And, you know, I think you have to be a politician who says, you know, my constituents have views that are important. And if I don't agree with them 100%, if they're overwhelming, as it is with the students at Western, I think you've got to be supportive of that. So I'm going to support this one. And I'm really looking forward to the projects that come forward. And what I would say is they should be not just limited to climate change, but there's all kinds of other areas they can be helpful in. And so I'm hoping that's what we'll see going forward. And I'm also open to more funding in areas that overlap, that provide us help in the area of climate change, but also help us with our infrastructure. So I think that's going to be an important debate going forward, and that's where I am.
All right, that exhausts the speaker's list. So I am going to open business case 5B, the Climate Emergency Declaration implementation, for voting.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed, 13-2.
Okay, next we have 17A, which is the community improvement plans. There's a 17A and B on this. I don't know if anybody wants to try to deal with those together or not. Councillor Lewis? Oh, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, so we have two different components of the CIP. I just feel like this discussion might take a little while. I'd like to move that, particularly as the staff are here who might be able to answer questions for us, that we deal with 4.13I, the London Library collections business case, which is the one immediately following the CIP.
Okay, so you want to move to deal with that one now. I'm just going to ask if there's any objections to that, because then we don't have to have a motion. Is there any objections to just dealing with the library case now? Nobody? All right, I'm going to deal with the library case now. I actually prepared a motion on this, so I'm going to ask the mayor to chair this particular item.
So we'll start in just a moment. The clerk's just handing out some information for our benefit. So colleagues, you should have the information with respect to business case 20, and you'll see in front of you as well. Amendment has suggested, why don't we start a speakers list to see where this is going to go? Why don't we start with Councillor Morgan?
Well, I'm happy to move the original business case, but I have this amendment to it, and I have a seconder in Councillor Squire.
To move the original and then go to the amendment? Councillor Squire? So we're moving and then we'll go right to the amendment. Go ahead, Councillor Morgan.
So what I would like to do with this particular business case, which is a business case related to collections, and it's really about the high demand materials that the library is looking to bolster. And I think there's a couple ways you can deal with the library collections. One is you can make a permanent funding addition, which the original business case contemplates to the London Public Library's collections budget. Another way to go on that is for us to take a little bit of money from the surplus that we've allocated and used a couple of times for the library to give them the same amount of money all up front and allow them to make their collections choices with that money, although it would not be permanent money. And I'll tell you why I think that's okay in this particular case, is because there's an important discussion happening on library collections at the federal level, and that is related to the costs of ebooks. And I'm not going to get into that detail, but there are significant asks of the federal government to intervene on this, which will reduce the pressures on the collections budgets for all libraries across the country, because the actions that the publishers are taking related to ebooks is really squeezing out how far library collection dollars can go. And so that's an important discussion. The FCM is going to be supportive. CULC is working on this, and I've been active on that as well. So I think what we could do is we could one-time support some money that will allow them to get the high demand materials taken care of in the short term. We allow that lobby work to happen, and at the next multi-year budget, should there be a need for a collections boost, we could consider it at that time. But I think that this can get the library what they need in the interim. I've worked with the library staff, and they're comfortable with this approach. And I think this is a responsible way for us to not hurt those who need the library services, particularly the collections, which is a core part of what the library does, and deal with an issue off the tax levy and allow for the time needed for the important lobby efforts at the federal level to happen.
Thank you. Any other speakers to this amended motion? It is up on your screen. Seeing none, I'll turn your attention to the screen as we vote.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed, 13-2.
Okay, I guess that actually deals with business case 20 because of the way that it was worded, because it was an alternate motion to the one on the floor. So business case 20 is done. Thank you for your support on that. We're going to go back to the two that we skipped over. That's business case 17A and 17B. I'll just ask, does anybody want to deal with those two separately, or do you want to deal with 17A and B together? So anybody who wants it separate, speak now, otherwise I'll look for a mover for both at the same time. All right, so I'll look for a mover for business case 17A and 17B, which are two components of community improvement plans together. Councillor Van Holst is willing to move that. Seconder, Councillor Kaivaga. Discussion on this. Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you very much. I do have seen some great success with community improvement plans, and I believe we do want to fund them as well. 17B in particular, community improvement plans offer the opportunity for purchase of properties and disposition of properties as well. So there's some special opportunities there. I wonder if at a future time we might put more into this, but I also look at this, and although I won't bring it up now as a possible change, but perhaps we should have something like this for heritage as well, where we're putting some money aside every year in case that we need to purchase a heritage property. So sometimes there's a property we might want to list, and I think we would be better off by purchasing it if we wanted to save it. So there's an option that we could have that might follow this pattern as well. So I'm happy with the investment. I'm not going to move that we have more. We could deal with that another time. But I also want to thank staff for creating this format, because I think it will be a valuable thing, not only here for the community improvement plans, but for also some other potential uses.
Other speakers? Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With respect to Part B, it looks like we're creating a reserve fund here. Are there rules or guidelines associated with it through you?
Question for our staff.
Through the chair, no, this was a placeholder for essentially to build a fund, not a reserve fund, but to build a fund so that there would be money available to acquire properties within community improvement project areas that would meet whatever criteria would be to established for those properties. It was simply that at this point.
Thank you. I imagine those will be forthcoming. I look forward to that. I think it sounds like a good idea.
Mayor Holder.
Thanks. With all respect, that's not what it says, though. It says by contributing to a reserve fund. That's kind of clear to me, and perhaps Mr. Barrett could explain the distinction, because it's not clear.
Mr. Barrett.
Sorry, through the chair, I apologize for that. Yes, I skipped ahead. Yeah, this is for a reserve fund for that purpose, to acquire properties that may be identified to be appropriate for acquisition to implement whatever project is coming forward as part of the community improvement project or part of the community improvement plan.
So Chair, seeing no I'm just looking here at the base budget and the impacts here. I think the spirit of being able to ultimately be able to purchase strategic properties makes, in broad terms, makes sense for and to do that to support our CIPs in broad terms makes sense. But I don't see any source of funding established in that. And can I ask the longer term intent with that, or any direction on that, or are we just creating, having these placeholders is a very nervous thing for me. I've heard that probably a dozen times today, and I'm getting a little weary of creating placeholders for something that we don't know what we don't know. And So I'm just being somewhat mindful as we do that. So I'm trying to understand if it's not funded, but the theory of it, which I'm not opposed to, isn't funded, why have we got it?
Go ahead.
Through the chair, if this might be helpful. So the intent is to put aside money to be able to specifically purchase properties through the CIPs in those areas. So currently, we have money that goes into our land acquisition reserve fund. We do not have sufficient fund to purchase for this type of a property through the CIP. So this would go into our existing reserve fund. We would earmark it separately for the CIP specifically, and we would utilize our existing processes to spend whenever an opportunity should arise.
And through you, Chair, so back to Ms. Barbone, then, is it necessary then to create this separate fund, reserve fund within a reserve fund to be able to do that? You'll have to help me understand that as well, please.
Through the chair, this is the tax levy contribution to be able to allow some money to be earmarked to be able to spend for this purpose. So currently, we have a contribution that goes to the Land Acquisition Reserve Fund. It does not have sufficient funding to be able to purchase lands through the CIP area. So we would simply be adding on an incremental tax levy contribution to give us some money that we could spend for that purpose in the future.
Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Chair. So yes, I do feel like this is creating a reserve fund. This is going to be a no for me. And I support the work that the Argyle BIA does. I'm quite proud of them. And I look at the business case deliverables in 17A, container planting and hanging basket programs, wayfinding, gateway and sign, destination signage, public art, including beautification and crosswalk painting. These are all things the Argyle BIA is already doing, and so are many other BIAs. You know, when we talked about the core area action plan, I said some of these things I feel need to be done by the private sector. And we had some discussions around those. We agreed on some, we disagreed on some, that was okay. And I think the core area in particular needed some special help because of special circumstances that arise in the core that don't necessarily arise with the same intensity in our more suburban commercial districts. You know, and then so we need to let the BIAs do the BIA work. We need to let the private sector fill in where it's appropriate for the private sector to fill in their neighborhoods. You know, these things are already happening. And then when I look at, you know, the creation of, or the land acquisition for, you know, potentially public parking lots, community centers or parks. Well, I don't think community centers are something we fund out of CIP. That comes out of the Parks and Recreation Master Plan. I am really, really not comfortable with how very vague and the mayor said placeholder-ish this feels to me. And I don't know, maybe I'm channeling my inner Councillor Squire because the mayor called me Councillor Squire instead of Councillor Lewis, but it comes back to something that Councillor Kayabaga said earlier in terms of priorities, and sometimes there are just things that we have to say no to, and this to me is one of those. Let's let our BIAs, they collect levies, we collect the levies for them, and then we approve their budgets, we approve their boards of directors, and they figure out what fits appropriately in their neighborhood. And I want to let them keep doing the great work that they're doing, but I think we're doing a pretty good job of supporting them so far, and look forward to seeing the other great things that they're going to do in the future. But a lot of the things I see in this business case are things they've already done.
I have Councillor Pelosa, Councillor Van Holst, and Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Also sharing some of those concerns over this one in regards to purchasing things. It sounds like a BIA mashup with neighborhood decision-making once you throw community groups in of looking at some tables, seating, and beautification they want to do. A question for staff. We're talking about the creation of city-owned facilities. Public parking lots. Can you speak to this? Is it another surface parking lot, or like what is that?
Through the chair, as part of the Hamilton Road Community Improvement Plan, one of the things that was identified in the discussions around that was access to parking. and the ability to parking on one hand, and then on the other hand, the city's parking standards when buildings would change use or when new users would come into buildings and new standards may be applied. And this was seen as a disincentive to the revitalization of portions of the Hamilton Road strip. One of the items that was identified that could help to address this was the possibility, if, and this I think speaks to the vague nature of this, that if there were lands that may be available, that may be for sale, that could be used for the development of parking, then this could be something, because that would support the intent of the CIP. And as was noted by the treasurer, there is money set aside where we acquire lands, but there's nothing that's specifically said to help implement a recommendation that might come out of the CIP. That's simply where this idea came from and what this business case is about. So that example of the parking lot was actually a real example of an initiative that was described by the community as part of making that community better through the CIP.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just, we seem to have a lot of conversations about parking and free parking and where to put more lanes of traffic. If we're talking about community centers and facilities, would love to see more things of investments of obtaining property and make a proper cycling infrastructure to get people to the park safer and our community centers to have more enjoyment. It does seem like another reserve fund. I understand where we're trying to go with it, but I think some of our other reserve funds could already accommodate this, and I'm not inclined to support it.
Councillor Van Holst, Turner, Helmer, and Hopkins.
Thank you very much. I hope that you do support this. There were a number of things in the community improvement plan for Hamilton Road which looked at some properties. There was some need there. And this particularly one of them, we got a number of restaurants and businesses in a place where there just isn't parking, but there's a lot that's been empty for a long time that would be great for that. If we could put something on there, that would make the businesses much more viable. And that was the problem. So we're not in the same situation on Hamilton Road as we are downtown, where we've got an abundance of parking. There's a great lack for that. So the philosophical argument for parking is much different in that particular area, and I hope people would go there and see how that is. I believe we're not creating a reserve fund. We're just adding to a reserve fund that's already there with some monies earmarked for this kind of thing, and it is important. The idea of community centers, I know that's also one that was recommended in this plan, because we don't have enough places in that area for people to meet. And there were great suggestions. People have come to me and said, I've got this program, I'm happy to provide it for free, I just need a place to do it. And for instance, Holy Cross School is now available. There's a couple of other properties on there that are just languishing and ugly, frankly, that the city could pick up and allow communities to do things in and beautify the area at the same time. So these are the kinds of things that would come forward for this, and you get to decide on them, but you'd also have an opportunity to see in a very non-vague fashion how great an opportunity those things are. So having a little money aside for that in particular, I think is important. And like I said, this same kind of model could be used for heritage as well, which is I think something we need to do again, is just have something aside to do things that will come to us and realize, hey, this is an important project, and we've got an appropriate source of funding to it.
Thank you. Councillor Turner.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I regret flagging this, but I think one of the things that's happening through this discussion is a bit of a conflation between a business improvement area and a community improvement plan. Perhaps I might ask through Mr. Barrett if he might be able to explain the difference between the two, if there's BIAs in all of these CIPs, and if their boundaries are different, and what are the objectives of each?
Mr. Barrett?
Through the chair, if I could answer that by no, yes, no, no. So CIPs, or community improvement plans, community improvement project areas, are not the same thing as a BIA. They have different purposes, they have different boundaries. Not all BIAs are in lands that have a community improvement plan on them. A BIA is a business improvement association, and as has been noted by some of the councillors, they have mandates, or specific mandates are around beautification, retention, and promotion of the businesses within that defined area. They are self-funded generally through the levy that they collect, and their budgets are their levies reflect their budgets. A community improvement plan is a plan that council adopts, because a community improvement plan provides council the opportunity to have community improvement incentives to promote whatever it is that specific community improvement plan is about. So downtown revitalization, revitalization in the Old East, heritage, those kinds of things. So we have CIPs for those kinds of things because they allow municipal actions, to support incentives or initiatives that would promote the intent of the community improvement plan. The councillor is correct. There's a little bit of back and forth on this, and that's actually one of the reasons I think why this business case is a little bit confusing. There are areas where a BIA initiative, and that's what Part A is about, is a BIA initiative may require some additional assistance in order to promote a small-scale community project, or that same type of action may be desired by a community association that doesn't have the tools and the finances where a BIA may be in place to help them do that. So that was what Part A is about. Part B would be much more specifically to a community improvement project area that may or may not overlap with a BIA. And that's where you get some of this discussion that's back and forth between the Business Improvement Association, or the businesses were looking for this kind of thing, but it's within a community improvement project area. Sometimes there's a nexus between the two of them, where in fact, in order to promote the aims of the community improvement plan, it looks at things like what can we do to improve the streetscape, which very often falls under the purview of the BIA. So that's where you get some of that overlap.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. I think that is quite helpful. And what's really important is to realize that the BIAs tend to deal with the commercial district facades along a single street. Not necessarily, the difference might be downtown, but the rest of them, the question of a community improvement plan speaks to a neighborhood and to a neighborhood level. So I think it's important that this is supported. I think it's a much different story than just what a BIA can do on its own, and they're different things. And they are not, BIAs do not exist in all of these areas and do not address all the same issues. And the BIAs are certainly in self-interest. The BIAs are trying to increase their business, and of course community associations are in self-interest too. They're trying to increase their community, but our interest is to be able to support both, but with different levers, and this identifies a different lever specifically for CIPs, so I hope you support this.
Deputy Mayor Helmer.
Thank you. Based on what I'm hearing, I think you're going to maybe need to separate them in the end. I know you asked if anyone wanted to separate it, but that may not be the case, I guess. I want to say on the issue of the small scale projects, I think this could be very good for areas like Hamilton Road, which is just getting established, Lambeth, where there's no BIA, and also Soho, where there's no BIA. A lot of these things are happening already in Old East Village, and the BIA is leading a lot of that work. A lot of these things happen downtown already, and I think Dundas Place and a lot of the things happening in the core area action plan will help cover off some of that same area. But nothing is really available in Lambeth or Hamilton Road or Soho to cover those things. So I think there's value in it. I hope that the funding goes to those areas, that they can take advantage of it. I think those small scale activations, they can actually add up to some pretty cool things that get you good value for money. On the land acquisition one, I just want to make a very strong case for this one, because in built out core areas, basically there's no place to put something new. There's already things everywhere, right? So, there's a building there, there's a park already, everything is already built out. And so you have to be very ready to seize opportunities when they come up. If something becomes available and there's an opportunity to move on it, you need to have funding available to take advantage of that. In a lot of these areas, the property values also are increasing relatively quickly. And so waiting, it can end up driving up the cost quite a lot. And what we've been seeing with the Land Acquisition Reserve Fund is we have used it in the past strategically to acquire properties to the point where we've really stressed the ability of that reserve fund to carry sort of what it's responsible for. So we put in something like $1.3 million a year into land acquisition, and we're drawing out of it constantly to cover off things all over the place, not just in these areas, but in other parts of the city. That is the fund, if I recall correctly, that we used to buy the Lorne Avenue Public School site, which is now being turned into a park and some housing. And that was a very strategic intervention to try and make the best of a bad situation using that land acquisition reserve fund. Something similar could come up in these CIP areas where there's a sort of once in a generation opportunity to buy something and convert it to a use that's in line with the CIP areas. But if we don't have a funding source for that, if there's not been some accumulation in a reserve fund to pay for it, the opportunity is going to pass us by. And I can think of places in Hamilton Road where, for example, you might have a very dilapidated building that needs to come down and it could be replaced with a parkette, right? One of those little urban parks, we see them in a couple places. Nice little addition to the community, taking the place of something that is really an eyesore and causing problems. I think there's lots of different opportunities like that, and providing a modest increase. This is essentially increasing the land acquisition reserve contributions by 7.8%. They've been stuck at this level for a long time. It's going to provide a little bit of money to allow for those things to happen over time. $100,000 a year doesn't get you very far when you're buying property. And so I think that that's a reasonable kind of contribution to allow these things to happen. I certainly know of opportunities that could come up in Old East Village on that front. If you want to put a park in a built-out area, that's not an easy thing to do. And you need to have the funding in place to move quickly when it does come up. Otherwise, you'll miss the opportunity. So I think that one is very important. I think the small-scale one, I think will be helpful, especially in the areas where there's not already a BIA.
Okay, and to your point, what I'm going to do is allow the debate on both, but I will call them separately. So, Councillor Hopkins.
Yeah, thank you. And again, I appreciate the debate. I have learned through the Lambeth Community Improvement Plan process that we supported, I guess, about a year ago, after a number of years of consultation in the community, that not one CIP is the same as the next. I think they're all very different. They mean different to all communities. The Lambeth CIP is totally different than the one in Hamilton Road, for instance. But it does give communities an opportunity to see how the community wants their neighborhood to look like and take advantage of opportunities. For instance, in the Lambeth CIP, facades and signages along Warncliffe was something that came out of that CIP. I am generally supportive of both these plans. And the reason I am is because it may not benefit the Lambeth community, but it gives opportunities for other areas in London to take advantage that will have their own unique and special requests. In Lambeth, we don't have a BIA. It came through that process. There wasn't a need for a BIA. Totally different priorities. I think if we just say totally no because you don't see an interest in your community, I think we're narrowing our focus. This whole idea is supporting neighborhoods, taking advantage of special projects like there's a number of them, from public art to creating lighting, enhancing safety. There's a number of options, but it's really up to the neighborhood. It's up to that CIP to take advantage of it, but we need to provide those opportunities. So I'm generally supportive. I'm stuck constantly. What are my priorities? And it's difficult. It's very easy to just say, no to, but when you think it through, when you see the progress of other CIPs in the London area and how successful they have been, and I think a lot of that is because they were given opportunities by the City of London.
Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Chair, and through you, I want to actually pick up where Councillor Hopkins just left off. CIPs have gone ahead without having to create this special business case before. We have tools through the planning department. We have tools through parks and recreations. We have tools through BIAs. And now we're looking to add at a time when, you know, this is a tough budget process. We've all acknowledged that through the course of these debates. Through you, Mr. Chair, I want to ask, just for example, because Councillor Turner raised a good point, community associations and BIAs are not the same thing. But through you to our staff, and I don't know whether this would be Neighborhood Fire and Children's Services or whether Parks and Rec, or maybe they both want to comment on this, but Councillor Pelosa referenced neighborhood decision-making. What other programs are currently available to support the works of community associations, neighborhood groups, through Neighbor Good, through neighborhood decision-making? What options are available to those groups already?
Through the chair, it depends. For example, if they're incorporated as a not-for-profit, they could apply through the London Community Grants Program, either the multi-year stream or the capital stream. And we also have on top of neighborhood decision-making, the Neighborhood Small Event Fund. Then that is directly for residents or grassroots neighborhood associations.
Great, so we've got things available through, that's through Neighborhood Fire and Children's Services, or Neighborhood Children's Services and Fire, which I always forget which order they go in. Anyway, so we have tools there. We have tools through neighborhood decision-making. We have tools through BIAs. And we've had CIPs come forward without having to have this special fund set aside for them. And I think opportunity does matter, but opportunity should come forward because it isn't a one-size-fits-all. They should be looked at strategically as opportunities present themselves. I don't think that this is a time we should be setting aside funds just to say, well, in case something comes up. I think when something comes up, we should make that decision. But I don't want to be putting money aside for something that might never come up. I want to see strategic investment when the opportunities arise. But that's where I'm going on this one. I think that there is a mix of, a good mix of tools already available to support community, to support business, to support neighborhood revitalization without creating another separate fund for things. Other departments have funds already, and we should be looking to do these things within existing budgets.
Councillor Van Holst.
Thanks, and in contrast to Councillor Lewis's opinion, I think that this A and B came forward because the tools were needed. Staff is just not making up something new for the case of bringing it to the budget. We've identified as members working on our community improvement plan that some new elements are required in order to make us able to fulfill that mandate, to do the improvement that the community wants. So I hope you support it. They're small, but they're nimble things that will make a very pleasant difference.
Okay. I did say I would call them both separately. If the mover and seconders are comfortable with still moving and seconding both, I'm just going to proceed with those movers and seconders. And again, we'll call them separately. So we'll do business case 17A first, and I will open that for voting.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed, 8-7.
Okay, and business case 17B. Same mover and seconder, Councillor, or Deputy Mayor Helmer.
Well, I recognize that, first of all, that was a very close vote, and this is a bigger amount of money. And it also is something where I think some money needs to be available to provide some flexibility to act on these opportunities if they come up in the next couple of years. And I think similar to what Councillor Morgan suggested with the library collections business case, that essentially taking all the money now and putting it into land acquisition reserve fund, rather than accumulating it over time, will probably allow for opportunities that couldn't be taken advantage of in the first year, to be able to be taken advantage of in the first year. And it won't allow a permanent source of funding for this, but it will at least get something in there that we could work with. And so what I would suggest is, by my count, I think we have at least 425,000 left in the operating budget surplus. The request for this multi-year budget period is 400,000. So I'd like to suggest an amendment, which is to take 400,000 from the operating budget surplus, move it into the land acquisition reserve fund to allow for this kind of thing to go ahead, and we can see what happens. And if we have to deal with longer term funding for it, I guess it'll be in the next multi-year budget. I think that may be the best way to proceed, given how the discussion has gone here today.
Okay, you have a seconder for that in Councillor Van Holst. Maybe I'll just check with the treasurer to make sure I get an update on the balance, the unused portion of the surplus that we referred to the budget process.
Certainly through the chair, the deputy mayor's math is correct. We have approximately 425,000 left.
So I'm going to get that motion up on the screen. That's moved by Deputy Mayor Helmer, seconded by Councillor Van Holst.
Just if it's helpful, I did just send an email with the language. I tried to draft something that would save time.
Yes, so we're doing this as an amendment to the source of financing because the other motion was on the floor. That's just the small change we're making to the wording there. And this is an amendment, so I'll look for debate on the amendment. Seeing Mayor Holder wanting to speak. Go ahead.
Just a couple of comments if I can. Just because we have it doesn't mean we need to spend it. And I'm very mindful that there's some monies in the operating budget to do that. I guess the consideration I would have on this is how much is enough. This starts to go into a reserve, and then what we'll then start to do beyond the reserve is then move more of that to operating, which, I mean, ultimately, I appreciate the goal is to try to establish a fund that gives us some flexibility to do these things. It strikes me that we may well have some other options as properties become available to acquire them, and to have this specific reserve and in particular in this section here causes me some concern. So I'll hear more comments on it, but at first blush I'm not inclined to support this. I mean, in part it's 400,000. What is that worth? What's that worth in ultimate in real monies? And what will that do for us as if several properties came due? I think there may well be some other opportunities outside of CIP where we might be able to consider acquiring property, and this just doesn't feel like the right vehicle to me.
Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just want to give an example of where this could be very helpful, and it's the Hamilton Road CIP. So it recently came to the Planning Committee, and and there were a number of changes to how we do things, rezoning and things like that, to assist the CIP to improve the area, which is what a CIP is supposed to do. And a number of people are in the gallery quite concerned about things that were being proposed, like reduction of required parking. Staff were recommending a reduction in the required parking for certain land uses because because as Deputy Mayor Helmer said, this is an existing built-up area. So if somebody is, owns a building and they would like to change the use on that building because of our parking formulas and things like that, they're limited in what they could repurpose that building for, because there isn't existing parking, enough parking on the site, and so the staff were proposing allowing these reductions. And the community was quite concerned about granting these reductions in available parking spaces. So this is something that can help that community, if we're only going to use parking as a specific example. So strategic purchasing of certain parcels of land to create municipal parking on that spot. And I know people don't want to talk about parking, but the reality is a lot of people still go to a business district and they go there in their car. So my question to you is not to amend anything, or a question to staff. If there was a municipal lot created or structure, because we don't like surface parking, if there was some sort of parking created through this program, could the revenues from that parking then be used hypothetically to replenish either this reserve fund or in some other way, so that we're actually letting our money work for and keep working for us?
I guess through the chair, the short answer, I guess, would be yes. We do have in the parking strategies in the base budget, we do have some funds put aside for such an endeavor, and that's funded through rates and fees. So that's already built in for potentially implementing the parking strategy, which would be some sort of above ground or below ground or joint venture parking system.
Thank you. So just that's just something that popped into my head, to see that we could, keep replenishing this fund depending on the way we use the land. But I think, when I think of the Hamilton Road CIP that came to the planning committee, and all of the work that staff have done with the community to seek ways to improve the area, then, I see this as a very natural fit. Downtown, we've invested a lot of money there, but they also do have a lot of resources through their BIA. And there are areas that don't have the same resources as downtown, and we have to, all of our neighborhoods matter. And London's only as strong as all of our neighborhoods put together. And so I think we need to invest in all of our neighborhoods in the City of London, and I'll be supporting this.
And just a reminder to colleagues that we're on the amendment at the moment. So is there any other speakers on the amendment? If not, okay, on the amendment, Councilor.
Absolutely on the amendment. Thank you to Deputy Mayor Helmer for suggesting this amendment, because it does make purchases available to us now. And we can come forward with projects and some suggestions that you'll get an opportunity to look at and decide on. But I was concerned about the plan the way it was, because I thought, we're going to have to wait. But this way it's a little better. So I think either way, I ask you to support this one, because it's a good path forward, and then vote however you like on the next one. I'll speak again to that a little bit, but this would be an improvement to what's been proposed.
Okay. No further speakers on the amendment, which is the source of financing piece. All right. Okay. So we'll open that for voting.
Closing, and the amendments passed 8-7.
Okay, that passed. So now we have 17B as amended with the new source of financing, which I'll remind people, we just had a debate on the concept when they were both together. But I'll look for speakers because I don't want to cut off important debate. But there are none, so, except for Van Holst.
Yes, I'm sorry. So, Mr. Chair, when I was a teenager, I was sometimes mortified. Yeah, I was mortified because I had this big, ugly pimple on my face, and I thought, oh, that looks terrible. And so sometimes when I drive down Hamilton Road now, I get a similar feeling because we're doing so well in making this gateway to the city, a very major gateway to the city, and there's a couple properties that, again, if those were to change, it would make things very much different and better. Those are the kind of opportunities. Remember, I just wanted to remind everybody that it's an improvement of a very important entrance to our city, and this will definitely help make a difference.
Thank you, and so I'll take that as you offering to move the amended motion. I'll look for a seconder. Councillor Kayabaga. Moved and seconded. This is the amended 17B with the new source of financing. I'm going to open the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion is carried 8-7.
Okay, we are going to move to case 22, I believe. Business case 22 is the Smart City Strategy 2020 to 2023. I'll look for a mover. Councillor Salih, he tried to second it too, but I'll need a different person for that. Seconded by Councillor Hillier. Discussion on the Smart City Strategy business case. Councillor Lewis.
Well, it's not something that we would obviously be deciding here, and we've got, you know, structural issues that we'll be looking at over the next little while within city departments and things. But, you know, for me, this is going to be a no. Adding another full-time person into this service area, creating an operating budget. I would suggest if we want to find an active transportation manager, one of the ways to do that is to restructure staff in the planning department so that one of those people works on being an active I think that would be smart for our city. So for me, the plan as presented is a no. It's very unclear what we want to accomplish out of this, and I think that it speaks to the fact that some of our priorities are changing as we look at climate change, its impacts, where we want to put our emphasis on. I think when it comes to just being smart adopters of early technology, the private sector does a much better job of that than us. There's things that we can do, but I'm not seeing the value in putting more money into this area right now. This is a spot where I'd like to look for an opportunity to refocus on the climate situation, in fact, and the active transportation manager. So I'm not going to support adding one here.
Councillor Kayabaga and then Mayor Holder.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. I think my colleague has raised a comment something that I'm curious about. Can we get some information on what this full-time staff member would be doing? What is their actual position? And if...
Sure, we'll get you that answer.
Through the chair, I'm going to predicate this by noting that this is in the list that's not in the administratively approved. This position is 3 years out and is anticipated that when this smart city strategy is up and running and implemented, that there would be or could be the requirement for the additional staff person. So that's what's in front of you. That person would be delivering on the initiatives and working on the programs that are under the 3 pillars that are identified about creating your culture, developing the infrastructure, and facilitating the initiatives. So where we are at that point in the strategy, that was the thinking that this position would be required.
Thank you. So I'm going to wait till I hear more conversation on this. I'm also reluctant to support this. I would rather as well see us put that funds towards having an active transportation person instead of this, and working towards continuing to address our climate action plan. So I will wait to see if how the discussion goes for my colleagues, but so far for me, I'm reluctant to support it.
Mayor Holder.
Thanks very much. I think there's a little confusion between if we're going to add another FTE full-time equivalent, do we go down the transportation road, or do we consider this through the Smart City Initiative as well? I don't think either is necessarily mutually exclusive. And I think it's two different roles. If we think that this has merit, then I'm going to suggest to colleagues that they vote on this in its own right, independent of whether a transportation person makes sense or doesn't make sense, and that's a discussion that we'll deal with. But I think it's two separate issues. So the question I've got to staff through you, Chair, is this. I read about the various roles that we are looking at for this smart city office to be housed in city planning. I look at things like ongoing education to instill cultural smart city thinking. I look at things like working with innovators in the private sector, raising awareness and developing partnerships internally and externally related to innovation and operational efficiency and other issues. And I'm just wondering, was there any thought ever given to presenting this to the LEDC, who we have on contract, to help us promote the attraction of business to, I think, and especially when I imagine the areas that we focus on well. So we have digital technology as one of our strengths. We have hospital technology as one of our strengths. We have commercial agriculture, again, as another strength. But looking at those and how you focus some of the initiatives and innovation associated with business growth, unless we're talking about a whole different direction. And I wonder if, again, if you can explain how this should be standalone, separate, versus, say, melding into an operation like LEDC as part of the planning process.
Through the chair, this, a lot of what the mayor touched on, I believe that this whole service, this whole office, is intended to actually be complementary to those types of services. The big issue right now is that there are a lot of people in the corporation who are doing these kinds of things. Smart cities, smart technology are coming. Artificial intelligence, those kinds of things are all coming. We're dealing with these types of initiatives now. Folks are working on these kinds of things. So this was intended at the outset to help try to centralize that and provide that. This would be the city working primarily with its external partners in how we do that. The city is a great player in that the amount of data that we have, the amount of information that we have, and the number of services that we provide could all take advantage of what could come from the outside in the private sector. This whole office was seen as facilitating that role and how that might work. So this position was, again, it was identified to assist in that, and it would be implementing the smart city strategy where we are at that point. There are lots of things that the city has to do to be ready for that would be through this office. For example, the whole notion of data governance, the whole notion of privacy around data and the desire for the access of all the information the city has and how that might help innovation on the outside. So that's what this was seen as an internal service with an external focus, not to compete, but to be complementary to those types of initiatives that are being pursued by places like the LEDC.
Thank you, Chair. So to help me understand, I appreciate that response. I think that certainly from my perspective brings some clarity to the intent. So I look at some of the roles, and I think, again, for those who have put some time into appreciating what the whole smart city approach does, I think it's interesting when you talk as far as one of the risks is that we've missed opportunities to improve efficiency and effectiveness in terms of service delivery. So with a limited budget in the first 2 years, what would before an FTE comes in, what would you expect to accomplish in those next couple of years, please?
Through the chair, really, what we really want to accomplish is really gelling what that implementation plan is and what it looks like, and what are those opportunities that we're going to be most looking to pursue. As I said, it's changing, but even work around establishing what the city's rules are, what the city's policies might be, particularly around things like data governance and those kinds of things, is something that perhaps would be consuming a lot of time at the front end, and then completing and implementing what that smart city strategy is and what it would look like. Certainly knowing how all the different players out there might fit in and how we begin to establish those partnerships.
So, Chair, I'm going to be inclined to support this insofar as relative to some of the budget items. This is modest, but more importantly, from an impact standpoint, I think the potential for impact for us as a city, I think, can be huge. I think the challenge is we're going out there not exactly sure what the outcomes can and will be. But I look at this in terms of leveraging our community partners and our tech industry resources. I look at something like that. A lot of this has to do with data collection. The key to me is what you're going to do with it once we get the data and how we administer that through and support groups like LEDC and Tech Alliance and others. So I see this as complementary. I don't see this as a big investment to be able to determine if in fact it has positive impact. This feels a bit like a pilot project, and I know we've talked about those, and that seems to be the death knell of any idea anymore. But I look at this and think that this, I think if done well, I'm prepared to take the, if you will, the chance on this, in that I think that what it does is the positive impacts in terms of attracting investment and supporting job creation through the organizations that we have now in place. I think that has legitimacy, and the fact that it would be brought in through our city planning department, I think that makes some sense to me as well.
Thank you. Councillor Sally and then Squire.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I was happy to move this motion because for me, I've been following this, and I know the city, we've been having these discussions at council since 2015. And to the mayor's point where he was mentioning about LADC's involvement, I know that they were involved in the initial draft and have been engaged throughout the process. But I think when looking and reflecting on our smart city draft, when you see that the three-prong approach we have, which is to create a culture of smart thinking, develop our smart infrastructure and facilitate smart city initiatives, I think it does take a lot of resources and it takes a lot of dedication, someone with the focus. When you look at other communities outside of London or outside of Canada, where there's expected in 2020, according to the IDC, 20% increase in smart city spending, I think it speaks to a lot of the opportunities and how we're trying to really catch up and we're really, really behind because there's significant opportunities which could result in savings. When you have smart cities doing things a little bit differently, there's saving opportunities, there's economic opportunities, and there's just more investments coming to your communities because you're doing things a little bit differently. So I'd encourage everyone to look at the draft and to support this because I think it's something important that we need to do. And it's something that I've been continually having conversations with people in Toronto and even people in British Columbia about this because I think there's a lot of opportunities for us, and I don't want us to miss this opportunity because I think we are leaders in certain regards when it comes to tech here, and I think we can continue to lead and actually be champions.
Councillor Squire.
Yeah, I have one question. When I'm reading some of the things that the money's going to be used for, it says support for hackathons. What, can you help me with what, through you, Mr. Chair, what's a hackathon?
Through the chair, a hackathon is in fact when we ask, or somebody asks, here's a problem, what are your ideas on how to fix it? And normally from a technological perspective. So there have been hackathons that the city's participated in where we put out a challenge around how would people know when my garbage is being picked up. We've got that now, but people came up with different ideas on how that application might work. So that's what a hackathon is. You put out the question, the challenge, and somebody comes up with an answer. We get a lot of things for free that way.
Through Mr. Chair, just reading this, it seems to me that part of what we're going to be doing is finalizing the actual strategy and implementation plan. In fact, it says this funding will be used to finalize the Smart City Strategy and Implementation Plan, as well as to begin implementation through procurement processes. So my concern, first of all, as soon as I hear us saying we're supplementing or things that are already happening, I do get concerned because I don't want us doing everything, and I have made a real point of prioritizing things in this budget. The other thing is, I'm very uncomfortable again with saying, well, we're gonna finalize the plan and then go on with it. There's no, I'd like to see the plan. I don't think there's, I don't remember seeing someone come back with a final plan and saying, here's our plan and here's what we want to do, and I just can't support that.
That exhausts the speaker's list. Councillor Van Meerbergen.
I see there, okay, so the Smart City office is already established, but there are 4 full-time people in that office. And I'm wondering, why do we need an additional person when there are 4 people there already?
Again, through the chair, this was seen as, and to Councillor Squire's point, the strategy has been prepared, the implementation plan is the next step. In other words, how do you begin to deliver on that? And so this was seen as a position that would be, looked like it would be required 3 years out, once we had this up and running, and once more work was being done, and more opportunities were either coming to the city, or the city was going out looking for more partners.
So what exactly do the 4 do now? Like, why couldn't one of the 4, 2 of the 4 work on implementation?
Through the chair, this office is actually just up and running. This is being done now. There are 4 funded positions. There are in fact only 2 bodies in those 4 funded positions. Those 2 bodies are doing all of the city's GIS work as it relates to the data management and running those things off, but they've also been doing some of the smart city type work around some of the virtual reality work that we've been using as part of our public engagement and public outreach. They've also been part of, I don't know how to best describe this, but being able to use our GIS in a way that it actually becomes more interactive and gives more answers, and we gave some examples with that with some of the presentations that we've brought forward as part of the work that we do. In addition to that, we've had other staff who have been helping on this outreach side. For example, a significant initiative that was undertaken by the city with support from folks in our office and folks in the city manager's office were around the MIX program, which was the innovative program around procurement, where instead of actually specifying the product, like the hackathon, we specified what the issue was and asked people to give us back a response as to how that might be. So we're participating in that program now. So we've got staff who, as part of their other job, are helping to support this initiative. This is, again, taking that strategy that you have, turn that into the implementation plan and bring it forward. And these funds were identified to help support that as it grows.
So just to be clear, there will be 2 others hired within the base budget. They just haven't been hired yet, and they'll be there to work on this.
That's correct.
Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Chair. This will be the last thing I say on this one, but it's very similar to what I said on the CIP cases. What I'm hearing is a lot of overlap on things we already have. Earlier today, we approved an expense for some new information systems, both for internal use and for the work that our staff do in the community. We have a very robust and I would say excellent IT support team already in place here with city staff. We have great organizations, to the mayor's point, like LEDC, Tech Alliance, who's Tech Alliance, I mean, the tech part is right there in their name. And then we have 4 spots and we haven't even filled 2 of them yet. to finalize a strategy, and yet we want to start putting money into a strategy that's not finalized yet, and start putting money 3 years down the road, but nonetheless within this multi-year budget cycle for a fifth person. We haven't even filled 2 of the 4 positions that have already been created and funded. And we did here. And I heard in business case 5B, and I said it at the outset, because I heard Councillor Kayabega mention it, an active transportation manager is an important position to me. A fifth position in a service area where we haven't even filled 4, without some more specifics around this, I heard the mayor say it's only a small amount. But I've heard it's only a small amount on a lot of things through this budget debate. And those small amounts would start to add up over time. But so far, there's been very few of those small amounts that we're gonna say no, that we've said no to, and this is gonna be one that I'm gonna say no to. I think our money here could be better spent elsewhere, including in the 5B on the climate change stuff. So that's where, I haven't heard anything that's changed my mind on that, and I just wanted to share those thoughts with colleagues.
Okay, Deputy Mayor Helmer.
So I think this is maybe an example of a project that got approved by the previous council, like the draft strategy came to us just at the end of the last term. It hasn't really been discussed by the current council at all, and here we are in the multi-year budget. And I'm not sure it's gonna turn out well for the smart city strategy. This was unanimously supported at the time, and the direction at the time was circulate this draft, we'll get some feedback, planning, go away in 2019 and work on a business case to come forward in the multi-year budget. That is what city staff have done, and now it's before us to say, okay, this is the kind of resources we need to implement the strategy. There are 3 FTEs in the base budget that are allocated already to the Smart City office, and what is recommended here is some money for software and to support some hackathons throughout this sort of 4-year period, and then hiring an additional 4th FTE out at the end of the period. And that seems to me like a very modest way of getting started on something that we are very behind on, generally speaking. So there are actually a lot of smart city type things that have been happening in the city, but there are different projects run by different areas, and there has never really been an office that's focused on it and trying to drive that culture throughout the city. And I think that's really what is happening with the reorganization that we've already had, and the funding that's already gone into those positions. So I think this is actually important and a good use of money that could potentially save us a lot of money. One really good idea that comes out of the Smart City office could have pretty great returns. They work on a lot of different things, and they're trying to transform how we're delivering services, right? So when you think about like Service London, Service Business London, there's a lot of these processes that get improved over time. Those can have really dramatic increases. We spend the same amount of money, but the level of service is way better. They sometimes don't show up as budget savings, but they show up as service improvements with the same budget. And I think the Smart City office is the same kind of potential. I also think that adding some additional resources to it is going to give it a better chance of success within the organization. This is a big organization. We got, I think, 3,500 people working in various different departments. Having just 4 people working on the Smart City stuff doesn't seem to be like an over allocation of resources. In fact, I think it's still kind of under. And I think that's a good use of people's time and effort. I can understand why people don't, if you don't think Smart City is a priority, you probably don't want to add people to it. I get that. But I think it is a priority. And I do think the sponsorship and software part, which is sort of the base, like we need that to implement this plan. Otherwise, nothing's going to happen, is a bit different than the additional person out in year 3. And so maybe there might be some middle ground there, which is at least go ahead with the software and the hackathon so the existing staff can actually get things going, even if you're not willing to put on the additional person in 2022.
Councillor Turner.
Thanks. So yeah, back in October 2018, this was passed unanimously by council. It was the previous council, but it was passed. And I think to Deputy Mayor Helmer's point, in terms of what an investment might look like, just one aspect of this is around open data and open government. And a great story where the power of open data comes from. Councillor Morgan has talked often about a citizen dashboard and being able to have open data from the government at fingertips to be able to take a look at how the city delivers services. Gold Corp, a long time back, had a whole bunch of land that when they did their surveys, they couldn't find any gold. And so they issued a challenge, and they actually did something that nobody else did. They actually publicly put out their data and said, if anybody can help us find repositories of, like veins of gold within our lands, we'll be happy to share the profits with you. And there was a significant modeling that was done by consortiums taking that data and taking a look, and it ended up being an incredibly profitable mine and endeavor, just because they crowdsourced the analysis of the data associated with that. And so that's one example of where a lot of success for a very moderate investment came out of play. But if you draw that same parallel to what the power of municipal data can be, if we have an open data set, but it's pretty limited right now. And as Mr. Barrett talked about hackathons, the opportunity for us to find people who are willing to play with municipal data sets and take a look at ways that we can do business better is profound, and without a lot of limits, actually. So I think this is one of those things that without funding an initiative that had some pretty strong support and from some pretty broad stakeholders in the community, in order to come up with the plan, I think we leave the plan somewhat orphaned. So I think it's important for support.
Okay, that again exhausts the speakers list. So I'm going to open this particular item for voting.
Closing the vote, the motion's lost, 7-8.
Okay, colleagues, it is 4:52, and I did want to do a hard break at 5, but what I'd like to do, given that the PPM starts at 6, is I want to recess now, just to give people a time so that everybody will be in their seats before the PPM starts. I think given the items left, there'll probably be some debate on them. So what I will say is just a couple of things. This meeting is going to be recessed until after the PPM. The PPM is a completely separate meeting from the agenda system perspective, so you will need to go out of this meeting and then go back in to the other meeting when you get here at 6. So you can't just leave things logged in. We'll remind you at that time, but right now I'd like to look for a motion to recess until after tonight's public participation meeting. A question? Go ahead.
Very quick question, since we're a couple minutes early on our break. Is it possible for staff to give us an update from the modeling as to where we are before we leave the chambers, or would that be easier for them to do after the PPM?
I'm sure Mr. Murray is always ready to give an update, the model. There's a whole team working on it as we make decisions. So we'll do that. I just want to, before that's done, is there any other questions on? Okay, great. We'll do that, and then I will look for that motion to recess until after the PPM. So go ahead.
So through the chair, we currently still sit at 4.2% on average. 2020 being a 4.9% increase, 2021 being 4.8%, and then dropping down to 3.6% in 2022 and 3.5% in 2023. So overall average still remains at 4.2%.
And the assumption there is that we were to pass everything that's left, correct, Mr. Murray?
That's correct, yes.
All right, so that's the update. Certainly we can show that again later tonight if colleagues need to go over it. I'll look for that motion to recess until after the PPM. Councillor Van Holst, Councillor Kaibaga, all those in favor? Okay, that carries.
Up earlier looking. Yep. Should be running up this stairwell, I'm almost sure of it.